So now we're going to focus on your stomach and the duodenum here. So when we look at the stomach has a lot of wall layers, which if you've looked over the slides, you've seen the wall layers under the stomach histology section, where we have a layer called the mucosa that's in direct contact with the food or the bolus that's soon to become chyme that's coming into the stomach. Then there's an outer layer called the submucosa, just outside of the mucosa, and then there's a muscular layer followed by the outer kind of serosa layer, the outer membrane layer. So we have a lot of smooth muscle surrounding the stomach in that muscular layer. There's also a network of nerves in that muscular layer called the myenteric plexus. And then in the layer just inside of that, the submucosa, there's also another network of nerves called the submucosal plexus. Both of these plexuses contain nerves from the sympathetic system, which would inhibit digestion. They have nerves from the parasympathetic system, which stimulates digestion. And then there's a part of the parasympathetic system that some people would actually consider to be its own division of the autonomic nervous system, but it's called the enteric division. And that just has to do with the stomach and the small intestine. It's really only dealing with digestion. And it's stimulating digestion, so that's why you could consider it to be part of the parasympathetic, but it's also very local, so that's why some people consider it to be its own little division. But the way that the enteric system here works is that within these plexuses you have these stretch receptors. So when the food hits the stomach and you stretch the stomach and it's kind of pushing out on the stomach wall, those stretch receptors sense that stretch and they go directly to motor neurons that are also found within these two plexuses that innervate the smooth muscle of the stomach. So there's these layers of smooth muscle going in different directions, so that when you stimulate these stretch receptors and you then stimulate the motor neuron and then you stimulate the muscle, you have muscles contracting kind of in all directions, and that causes a lot of mixing and churning, just kind of mushing up the chyme so that you have just a blob, essentially, a very acidic nutrients ready to be broken down entirely. Now these are called enteric reflexes, or short reflexes, because they're very short. They're just happening right here in these two plexuses and the smooth muscle that's right underneath of that. So it's not going a very long distance at all. The parasympathetic system also obviously plays a role in stimulating these smooth muscles and then also stimulating glands in the stomach. Now the glands in the stomach, there are two main types of glands. Gastric glands and pyloric glands. The gastric glands have two kinds of cells in them, and so do the pyloric glands. In the gastric glands, the two types of cells are parietal cells and chief cells. Parietal cells make hydrochloric acid, which is what acidifies the chyme to a pH of 1 or possibly 2, so super acidic. And they also make something called intrinsic factor. This is going to become important later in the digestive process because it's going to pass through the duodenum, pass through the entire small intestine, and on into the large intestine. But it's bound to vitamin B12. And with intrinsic factor bound to vitamin B12, that's how you absorb your vitamin B12. Without the intrinsic factor, you can't absorb your vitamin B12. Now the chief cells make something called pepsinogen. And when pepsinogen is exposed to acid, like hydrochloric acid, it converts into something called pepsin. And what pepsin does is it begins the breaking down of proteins, the denaturing of proteins. It's not going to complete it, it's just going to get it started so that we have something for our pancreatic juice to work on, kind of a head start for our pancreatic juice once we get into the duodenum. Now for the pyloric glands, we have G cells and D cells. I'm sorry, it got all smushed at the bottom there, but G and D cells. The G cells make something called gastrin. Gastrin stimulates the gastric glands, both kinds of cells. And the D cells make something called somatostatin, which inhibits both of the cells in the gastric glands. So This is for stimulating stomach activity. This is for inhibiting stomach activity when food has already passed through and you have no more need for releasing all of these things. Now, once the chyme has passed out of the stomach, so a couple of hours, and then on into the duodenum, we're going to have bile coming from the gallbladder, which was made in the liver but stored in the gallbladder, and that comes down through the common bile duct. We have pancreatic juice coming from the pancreas in the pancreatic duct. And they're going to be dumped into the duodenum through this little kind of pimple here, not really a pimple, a little bump in the duodenum called the duodenal ampulla. There is a smooth muscle that wraps around these tubes and controls secretion through that ampulla, and that is called the hepatopancreatic sphincter, which you may have already seen in your lab section, but that's just that little round smooth muscle that can close off secretion from the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct, or can dilate and allow more secretion. Now these secretions come into the duodenum, join the chyme. Okay, so we've got all this chyme, it's very acidic. Bile has buffers in it, so that deacidifies the chyme, so that helps to protect the cells of the intestines from all that acidity. And then the pancreatic juice has enzymes that are going to break down our various nutrients. The bile is also going to play a role in lipid breakdown, so we'll get to that in a minute. But what I want to focus on right now are the enteroendocrine cells that are in the duodenum that are going to help coordinate digestive activities from the liver, the stomach, and the pancreas. So there are four main kinds of cells in the enteroendocrine section here. S cells, which are found in something called the crypts of Leberkuhn. That's on the slides, but I'll write it here anyway. Just kind of a neat name. Crypts of Leberkuhn. And those S cells produce something called secretin. Secretin helps to stimulate bile production, so you get more bile coming from the common bile duct. And it also goes to the pancreas, in particular the beta cells of the pancreas, and it causes them to secrete insulin. And if you remember back to our endocrine system unit way back in the beginning of the semester, insulin is important for helping your cells to be able to store sugar, essentially, taking glucose from the blood and putting it into the cells. And when you're just eating a meal, you know, all this food is coming through your stomach and going into the duodenum, you're about to absorb a lot of, carbohydrates, sugar, essentially, as well as other nutrients. So it's important to have insulin so that you can do something with those nutrients. The second type of cell are the K cells. They secrete gastric inhibitory polypeptide, which does exactly what it sounds like it's going to do. It inhibits your stomach by inhibiting gastrin. And remember, the gastrin comes from the pyloric glands, and it stimulates all of your gastric cells. So if you are inhibiting gastrin, you're inhibiting all of the stomach activity here. Now the K cells also help secretin to secrete insulin. So they help stimulate insulin production. So secretin and gastric inhibitory polypeptide both stimulate insulin, so they go together in that way. Now the I cells produce something called cholecystokinin, and cholecystokinin goes to the pancreas, and it goes to the acini in particular, which are the exocrine cells in the pancreas, and it causes them to secrete pancreatic juice, which is where we have our breakdown, our enzymes that cause breakdown of our nutrients, which will be on our next video. Next, we have Brunner's glands. The Brunner's glands secrete urigastrone, and they inhibit all of the gastric glands, just like gastric inhibitory polypeptide did. So gastric inhibitory polypeptide inhibits the gastric glands along with urigastrone. Gastric inhibitory polypeptide stimulates insulin along with secretin. So this sort of, they're sort of working together to help coordinate digestion. Okay, we'll take a pause and then we will look more deeply at pancreatic juice for our next video.